It's called An Arc of Electric Skin. And it's a story about, there's a bit of romance, there's a bit of revolution, there's a bit of superhero, weird science that doesn't 100% add up, but works for what I wanted it to do in the story. So I hope you enjoy it. All right. So, An Arc of Electric Skin. For a long time, I wondered what kind of person would volunteer to have their skin exposed to temperatures cycling between the melting point of aluminum and the nighttime surface temperature of mercury, riding a wave of thermal torment that would drive most people insane with pain. Now I know. I fell in love with such a man. He was ungraciously tied to an anti-ionization pole and executed by a 6-man firing squad in front of the dirty gray wall of Kirikiri prison before a hushed crowd of witnesses. I never even got the chance to say a proper goodbye. I was in the vice grip of 3 burly Secret Service officers, tears still streaming down my face, even though I'd been crying for days. His afro was wild and uneven. The white jumpsuit he'd been dressed in was frayed, but clean. And his eyes were still as defiant as they'd been the day he'd walked into my office at Lagos University Teaching Hospital and said with a calm composure that belied all the rage that must have been inside him, "Dr. Ogumbi, I read the paper you published with Professor Aliyu, and I want to volunteer." His real name was Akachi Nwosu, but the media called him Shock Absorber because he used to be a roadside mechanic before he met me and taught himself to wield lightning. My people believe that names are tied to one's essence and can influence or predict one's destiny, a bond to one's Ori. I think Akachi's people have similar beliefs because he told me his name means hand of God. It was appropriate. What else would you call a man whose destiny drove him to find a way to hold on to the raging flow of displaced electrons and bend them to his will? My heart aches now because I miss his determined eyes, his hard hands, his smooth skin, his soft voice, but also because in fragile moments, doubts overwhelm me, and I'm not sure if I ever really knew him at all, completely enough to have truly loved him. And in the darkest of those moments, when I think about his final deception, I'm not sure if he ever truly loved me either. He graduated from the University of Ibadan with a degree in electrical engineering, during which he had attended guest lectures by my senior research partner, Professor Aliyu. He graduated with a first-class degree and a fascination with electrical systems, despite having to work part-time as an assistant at a mechanic shop, where he also lived because he couldn't afford accommodation. But he couldn't find a job in the crumbling post-oil economy, so he took what little savings he had and started a small mechanic shop of his own next to Ojota Motor Park. He showed me pictures of it while we lay in each other's arms 2 nights before the procedure. It was little more than a zinc roof over a dusty land and a pile of secondhand tools. The profits weren't good, but he worked hard. His calloused hands bore witness. He spent hours attending to junky jalopies that were barely roadworthy, but heaven knows he did his best with them. His own mother had died in a bus, just like the ones he frequently serviced, in an accident on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway that everyone knew was caused by a contractor cutting corners on what should have been road barriers. An accident he barely survived himself, needing 5 months in the hospital to recover and learn to walk again. His father had sold everything he owned and borrowed from family members just to afford the care his son needed. So when Akachi worked on those buses and cars, he told me, he saw the faces of the families that would get into them, hoping to make it to their destinations. And so he worked as hard as he could to make sure they did. He really did endure every brick the crumbling system threw at him: constant police harassment, raids for bribes, aggressive underpaying clients, random changes in government policy that almost always meant he had to pay more for something, thieving and untrustworthy assistants. All of this under the blistering heat of the Lagos sun, increasing his already high melanin levels, his darkening, another physical marker of his endurance. And still, he persisted, my Akachi. He had a strong mind. This country happens to all of us, he told me the first night I had asked about his scars. That was his philosophy. It happens to some of us more than others. He eventually saved enough money to move out of the Face Me, I Face You he shared with friends from university and into a self-contained in an almost respectable part of town. He was working his way up the broken system, keeping up with the Nigerian Journal of Electrical and Electronic Applications, and still looking for a job where he could apply the knowledge that still fascinated him. And then he went to the campaign rally. Ezekwe for president, easy, easy, a new Nigeria. We all remember the slogans, the digitags, the posters. Ngozi Ezekwe announced her candidacy quietly at a small event near her hometown in Oka. But within a few months, she had become the leading opposition contender. She was a technocrat with a plan, unlike the political vultures circling the federal caucus that we'd become used to. She came in with a clear agenda, an empathetic ear, and grassroots support from businesses she'd helped survive the economic apocalypse. We all remember the hope, and we all saw what happened. Provision display decks crackled with high-resolution hollow streams of soldiers beating unarmed people in the streets, dragging them into the backs of armored trucks, firing live rounds into defiant crowds, breaking up the opposition rallies and protests. Akachi was one of those people taken into custody near the infamous Ojota protest site, where almost 40 people were killed. He was beaten and tortured for weeks. The Gusau administration made no secret of what they did, even though the president denied giving the order on international broadcasts. But on the ground, we all knew what it was. We'd seen it before. Their regular trademark. It was a show of force to intimidate the opposition and its supporters. We were living in a hostage state. It was during his weeks of torment that something broke in Akachi. To be treated that way by those that were meant to protect and serve you, to know that they could kill you and nothing would happen. It does something to your mind. Pain can clarify things. He told me later that after hours of unrelenting terror and agony, he'd stopped fearing death, that he'd realized then that he'd been so focused on surviving the system that he'd never ever truly been alive, and that he was doing nothing but dying slowly and had been doing so for a long time. He told me when he was released, he'd resolved to ensure things changed. I wish I had known exactly what he meant then. I'm not recruiting test subjects yet, I told him that day in my office, after he'd explained who he was and what he was talking about. We still have a few iterations to ensure we can manage sensory response. You mean pain? Yes, I told him. Right now, we can only ensure subject survival and prevent long-term tissue damage, but we are still working to limit the impact of extreme temperature microexposures on pain receptors. The body and the mind will protest, even under anesthesia. I can handle pain, he said calmly. I just come back from a session with the visiting council at the African Academy of Sciences to make my 7th application for additional funding after a week of sleepless nights, running calculations and preparing proposals. The potential of our research was enormous. Even the most conservative members of the council weren't myopic enough to miss the value in being able to use enhanced conductivity in human skin to develop a new category of biomedical devices. Devices that could be naturally embedded in the body and controlled using dermal interface circuitry. They just wanted to see more progress before they committed to helping us. Professor Aliyu had already designed and tested a prototype device using enhanced conductivity in discarded epithelial extracts, but we needed to show that we could make this work in living people. I felt like I was the one holding things back. I was under pressure to make some progress. I should have been more skeptical. I should have asked more questions. I should have told Akachi to wait until we were ready, but instead I asked him to fill out a form. It took a few weeks for me to convince Professor Aliyu to cross what he believed to be a moral line, and for us to perform all the preliminary tests and screening processes. We spent much of that time together. Akachi sitting just outside my office, quietly watching me or reading, patiently waiting for another blood or skin or hair sample collection, or for another baseline skin conductivity measurement. I never asked him why he never left the hospital in between tests, but I did ask him to join me for dinner once as I was closing for the day. He seemed so focused sitting there, reading an old battered electrical engineering book. But I don't think I will ever forget the soft smile that broke across his face when he looked up and the way he said, "Yes, doctor, please, let me take you to the best booker in Surulere. I hope you're hungry." "I am," I said. I hadn't eaten all day. So we went to eat amala and gbegiri at a makeshift shop down the road. An old lady in a black blouse and an Ankara wrapper scooped up soft lumps of yam flour, loaded them with generous helpings of soup and meat, and we took seats on the plastic chairs behind her. We spoke as we ate, and that was the first time we talked about anything other than the experiments. But the conversation flowed naturally, easily. We spoke for hours until the old woman told us she was closing for the day. It wasn't planned, but we went back to my place and we kept talking. He showed me some of his scars and I told him more about my work. And we kept speaking until we finally fell asleep together, face to face on my bed, with all of our clothes still on. When we woke up in the morning, we laughed and then we kissed, leaving me a little lightheaded, like I was still asleep in a dream. It was only later that a feeling of wrongness settled upon me. He was in some sense my patient, but nothing that happened that day was planned. And sometimes you get caught in a river and you can't do anything but flow. Love can be a strange and sudden thing. 3 days after he'd passed the final screening, I led him into the bio-annealing cell I'd designed with Professor Aliyu. He squeezed my hand as he stepped into the black ovoid pod, with wires and tubes running out of it like so many umbilical cords. He smiled at me before securing the fiberglass mask over his face. Professor Aliyu was nested comfortably in his wheelchair, monitoring the thermal induction and vacuum pump systems that would rearrange the molecular structure of the melanin in Akachi's skin. Part of me wanted to pull him away, wanted to wait until we had improved the bioannealing procedure to the point where we could do it with less pain, or perhaps to reduce the target conductivity increase from the theoretical limit to a near threshold value, even though I knew that that would only reduce the pain induced by a fraction and increase the risk of process failure. For sure, if I'd known then what he was planning to do, what he had resolved to do all along, I would have dragged him out of there. But I didn't. So I stepped back and I gave Professor Aliyu the signal to begin. He screamed, but we could not hear him. He screamed for the 3 hours it took to increase his skin conductivity 50 orders of magnitude. I stepped out of the room to cry. I still wonder how he managed to endure it. I still wonder how I could put someone I loved through that. I suppose I'll always wonder when it comes to Akachi. It was only a month later that I understood why he did it. I saw it all in high-resolution holostream, same as everyone else. Incumbent President Umar Gusau was standing in the back of an electric black Mercedes T-Class pickup truck, flanked by Secret Servicemen in dark suits and military attachés in camouflage, as he waved to a crowd of paid supporters. Although he was supposed to be resting at home and preparing for his conductivity stability test that day, I saw Akachi on the core vision screen. He was initially an almost invisible speck in the sea of people. Almost invisible, that is, until he pulled up an umbrella fitted with what I later came to find out was a high-powered laser and fired it silently into the sky, where it formed an ionized column of air, an artificial conduit for electrical discharge. When lightning finally tore down from the sky in a hot, bright streak, he reached up and seized it like a whip made of bright electric death. I gasped audibly and didn't even notice that I was spilling my cup of hot Lipton tea onto my desk. He struck down at the presidential procession in a smooth, clear motion. There was a deafening explosion of thunder, a flash of impossibly white light, the scattering of dust and particles and fragments. The holographic displays went dead. and I exhaled deeply, letting out the breath I didn't even know I'd been holding, and seeing the brown spill that was spreading steadily across my desk. I didn't even bother trying to wipe any of it. My eyes remained glued to the fuzzy, crackling images being transmitted from Abuja. When the holostreams were established and everything had settled, there were bodies, there was fire, and there was blood. I'll stop there. It's about half the story, I think, or a bit more than half.